Amos Rourke had been told the woman coming up the mountain was hard as a horseshoe nail and twice as cold, and standing at the edge of Cutter's Gap with the wagon brake set and his hat turning slow in his hands, he was half inclined to believe it. Hollis Pruitt, who carried gossip the way other men carried chewing tobacco, had set it plain across the store counter 3 weeks back. Twice widowed, that one. Lost a husband and a babe both, back in Kansas. Nobody there ever saw her weep over it, nor crack so much as a smile since. And a woman gone that cold will run your house cold and send your little ones to bed colder still. Amos had thanked him and paid for his flour and thought about the two faces waiting for him up in the high park. Ruth, who was 8 and had started to forget her mother's voice, and Toby, who was 5 and had never rightly had a mother to forget. He needed the help. He had written the letters because he could not do it alone, and now the help was stepping down off the tailgate of Pruitt's wagon in a plain gray traveling dress with a small hide-covered trunk gripped in both hands, and she did not smile, and she did not look away either. What Amos Rourke did not know, watching her come with his heart already sinking, was that inside of a single month this same unsmiling woman would walk straight into a wall of fire for 2 children who did not carry a drop of her blood, and come out the far side of it having burned to the ground everything he thought he understood about what warmth was and where a body might find it. If this story is touching your heart, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And if a woman in your family came west with nothing and built a home, share her name in the comments. I read every one. She had a still face and level eyes the color of creek stone, and knuckles chapped raw from lye and cold water, and when she reached the ground, she looked him dead in the face and said, "Mr. Rourke," flat, not a question but a fact set down between them. He thought, well, so is true then. "Naomi Croft," she said, when he did not answer quick enough. "You wrote that you had 2. "I did. I do." He set her trunk in a wagon bed himself and reached to hand her up, and she took the step on her own before his hand got there, not rude about it, only used to managing. She settled on the seat with her back straight and her hands folded, and he clucked the team up onto the wagon road that climbed out of the gap in long switchbacks through the spruce. For the first mile, she said nothing, and he told himself Pruitt had the right of it. For the second mile, he stole looks at her and was less sure. She watched the country the way a person watches a thing they mean to remember. When the road broke out of the timber onto the shoulder of the mountain, and the whole high park opened below them, green and folded and running up to bare gray peaks with the last of the snow still lying in the north seams, he heard her breath catch, just barely, and her hand came up an inch off her lap and then went back down. "It is a long way from anything," he said, because he figured he ought to warn her. "I know what a long way from anything looks like," she said. "This is prettier than most of it." That was more words than she had strung together yet, and the flatness of them made him want to keep her talking, but she had already gone quiet again, so he let the team pull and said no more. The cabin sat in a bench of level ground with its back to a spruce ridge and its face to the south, and below it and off to the east stood the barn, a long pull-in shake building Amos had raised his second summer up here, with the horse stalls and the cow stanchion and the loft above where this year's hay was already stacked green and sweet. Smoke stood up straight from the cabin chimney in the still evening air. Ruth came out onto the step first with Toby half hid behind her skirt. The two of them scrubbed and put in their good clothes because Amos had made them, and they stood there staring the way children stare. Naomi looked back at them without any of the cooing that grown folks generally did. She climbed down before Amos could come around, and she stood a moment in the yard just looking at the two of them, and Ruth lifted her chin the way she did when she had decided to be difficult, and said, "Pa says you're to keep house." "That is the arrangement," Naomi said. "You're not what Mrs. Rose said." "I expect I'm not," said Naomi, and there was a ghost of something at the corner of her mouth that was not a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one, and Ruth, thrown off her aim, said nothing else. Toby looked up from behind his sister's skirt with his thumb near his mouth, and his lower lip chapped and split, and Naomi crouched down to his height, slow, and did not reach for him. "That's a sore mouth," she said. "I've got salve in my trunk that'll take the sting out of it, if you'll let me." Toby considered this with the gravity of the very young and nodded once. And that was the first ground she took on that mountain, an inch of it from a 5-year-old before she had so much as stepped through the door. Inside, The cabin was clean the way a house is clean when a man keeps it, which is to say the floor was swept and the dishes were done and nothing else. There was one main room with the stove and the table and the 2 chairs and a bench, a small room off the back where the children slept, and a ladder to a half-loft where Amos had his bed. Naomi stood in the doorway a moment, taking the measure of it, and Amos watched her eyes go around the room and stop, just for a breath, on the open firebox of the stove where the flames showed orange through the grate. Something crossed her face and went, quick as a shadow off water, and then she stepped in and set her trunk against the wall and said, "Where do I sleep?" "There's a corner curtained off in the children's room," Amos said, and heard how it sounded, and pushed on, "till we see how it suits both of us. I didn't figure to rush you to a preacher before we'd laid eyes on one another." He had meant it as a decency. He watched her take it as a door left ajar, an arrangement that could still be sent back down the mountain unfilled, and she said only, "That's fair," in a voice that had folded something away, and went to see about the supper. She could cook. He learned that the first night, which Pruitt had left out because it would have spoiled the story. She took the venison he had hanging and the last of the spring's potatoes and some dried morels she found in a sack, and she made a supper better than anything that had come out of that stove since Ada died. And she set it in front of the children without ceremony and watched them eat before she ate herself. Over the meal, Amos found himself saying more than he meant to about how Ada had been gone 2 winters now, taken by the lung fever the same week the pass closed, so there was no getting the doctor up, and Naomi listened and did not offer him a single soft, useless word, only said, when he was done, "The winter takes what it wants up here. It doesn't ask." And he looked at her and thought that was the truest thing anybody had said to him about it in 2 years. She gave him almost nothing of her own in return. When Ruth asked, bold, whether she had children of her own back where she came from, Naomi said, "I did," and passed the bread, and the flatness of the 2 words closed the subject like a hand closing a book, and even Ruth had the sense to leave it. The first week set the shape of the days. Naomi rose before Amos did and had the stove going and the coffee on and the mush ready when he came in from the morning chores. And she packed the children a dinner pail because she had decided the 2 of them ought to have their noon meal proper, even up here with no school to carry it to. She learned the place fast, faster than Amos looked for from a Kansas married woman. She found a spring house and the root cellar and the smoke shed without being shown twice. She took over the milking inside 3 days because she saw his burned hours were better spent on the stock and the fences, and the cow, who had kicked at every soul but Amos since Ada passed, stood quiet for Naomi from the first, which he noticed and could not account for except that animals, like children, seemed to know the difference between a body who fussed and a body who simply meant them no harm. When the sorrel gelding tore, his fetlock open on a snag of wire out past the garden, screaming and lashing at the rail, it was Naomi who got a rope on him and a twist in his lip and cleaned the gash and stitched it with a needle from her own kit and a thread she boiled first, talking to the horse the whole while in that low, even voice. Ruth stood at the rail and watched the cold woman her Mrs. Rowe had warned her about sew up a torn horse without turning a hair, and something in the child's certainty about the world tilted a little on its base. That night Amos came in from seeing to the stock and found Naomi standing at the door with a bucket of water set beside it that had not been there before, and the lantern turned down but not out, hung on its nail where she could reach it. "You expecting a fire?" he said, meaning it light. She did not take it light. "I like to know where the water is," she said, and went behind her curtain, and he stood in the middle of his own house feeling as though he had stepped on something in the dark and could not tell what. The whispering he could not keep from her, though he tried. 10 days on he took her and the children down to the Gap for the Sunday meeting, because a man could not just keep a woman up a mountain with no word said. The meeting house was full of the ranch and mine and store families, and heads turned when the Rourke wagon came in, and Amos felt her go still beside him on the seat, gathering herself the way she had at the trailhead. Delphia Rowe, whose husband Cret ran cattle down the draw and who had appointed herself the judge of who was decent in that country, looked Naomi up and down from the church step and did not put out her hand. "So you're the one," Delphia said. "We heard." "You heard wrong. Most likely," Naomi said level. "But it's no matter to me either way, and she walked on in with Toby's hand in hers, and Delphia's mouth went flat as a nailhead. Inside, two of the women behind them talked in the low, carrying voices women use when they mean to be overheard, about widows who bury their grief so deep it turns to ice, and about what kind of woman does not weep for her own dead babe. Amos watched Naomi's hands in her lap go white at the knuckle and then loose again, and she did not turn around, and she sang the hymns in a low, true voice and looked straight ahead at the front of the room. Only once did anything crack. When the preacher read the verse about the widow and her two mites, the one who gave out of her want and not her plenty, Amos saw Naomi's eyes close for the length of a breath and open again dry. Old Elias Booth, who kept the store and had buried a wife and two grown sons and knew the article when he saw it, leaned over to Amos on the way out and said low, "That woman is no more cold than you are, Rourke. She has stood in a fire and learned to hold very still so as not to feed it, and there is a world of difference between the two. You would do well to learn it before you decide which one you married." Amos did not answer him, but the words sat in his chest all the way up the mountain. For a while, even he caught the settlement's way of seeing her. There was an evening he came in tired and out of temper from doctoring a down cow that died on him anyway. And Naomi had held his supper warm and set it in front of him without a word, and he heard himself say, short and unfair, that she needn't look at him like he was a chore that wanted finishing. She only said, "I wasn't looking at you like anything, Mr. Rourke," and took her own plate out to the step and ate it in the dark alone. And he sat there with his supper going cold and felt about 2 inches tall, because it was he who had carried the coldness into the room and then blamed her for the chill. He went out after a while and did not rightly know how to say he was sorry, and what he managed was, "I spoke wrong in there." She said, "You're grieving too. It's crooked in a person. I know how it sits," and moved over on the step to make him room. And that was the first night they sat out under the stars together, not saying much, two people who had each learned young what an empty house sounds like. Booth told him the rest of it a week later, and told it plain, because he judged Amos ought to know. Naomi Croft had married a man named Daniel back in Kansas, a good man by every account, a miller, and they had a boy not a year old when the house went up one January night from a cracked stovepipe while they slept. Daniel got Naomi out through the window and went back in for the baby, and the roof came down, and Naomi stood in the snow in her nightdress and watched the house burn to the sill with her whole family inside it, and could not get near enough to do anything but scream. When it was done, she stopped screaming, and by what folks could tell, she had not made much noise since. She had gone to work at a fever hospital over in Leavenworth after, Booth said, on account of she could not abide sitting still, and she had learned real doctoring there, burns above all, the way a woman will study the very thing that took everything from her the way another might study Scripture. She had come west because there was nothing left back there but the two graves and the ash. So when you see her dry-eyed, Booth said, know that she felt it all the way to the bottom and found out there is a bottom and climbed back up and does not aim to go down there again in front of your town women for their entertainment. Amos rode home slow that day and looked at the bucket by the door with new eyes, and at the lantern hung where she could reach it, and understood for the first time that the woman under his roof had never once been braced against his children. She was braced against one thing only, the thing that had already cost her the world, and she kept the water where she could find it, because she had learned the hard price of having to look for it. Something turned over in him after that, though he could not have said it out loud, and so mostly did not. He stopped leaving the arrangement hanging in the air like a threat. He started asking her opinion on things, and she gave it plain, and it was good sense every time. The children came to her by inches. Toby had taken to trailing her the way he trailed his own shadow, and Ruth, though she would have died before she admitted it, had stopped folding her arms. It was Ruth's nightmare that broke the last of it, 3 weeks in. The girl woke screaming from a dream about her mother that she would not say out loud, and Amos, up in his loft, her Naomi's bare feet crossed the floor before he had his own under him, and by the time he came to the doorway, she was sitting on the edge of the children's bed with Ruth pulled in against her, not saying they're there, not saying anything at all, only holding on and humming something low, an old tune with no words to it. The kind a woman hums when she has hummed it over a cradle. Before, Ruth's crying wound down and stopped. Toby had crawled over in his sleep, and fetched up against Naomi's other side. Amos stood in the dark and watched the three of them and felt his throat close. And Naomi looked up and saw him there and did not stop humming and did not look away. And something passed between them in the dark that neither one had the words for, and neither one went hunting them. After that night, the last of the wariness between Naomi and the children came down like river ice in a thaw, all at once and with a great deal of noise. Toby made himself her shadow and would fetch her a stick of stove wood with enormous ceremony and wait to be told he was a help, which she always told him, because it was true, and because a boy who had never had a mother to please deserved to learn the pleasure of pleasing one. Ruth was slower and prouder, and Naomi did not court her, only left the door open, and one wet afternoon the girl came and asked, offhand, as if it did not matter at all, whether Naomi would teach her to make the salve the real way, the way that took the sting out. They spent the whole afternoon over the stove, rendering tallow and steeping the herbs Naomi grew in her new patch, and by the end of it Ruth was calling the recipe hers, and Naomi led her, and that was how you did it, an inch at a time, no chasing. Word had begun to go down the mountain, too, that the Rourke woman knew doctoring, real doctoring, and one at a time folks came up the road with a child's croup or a burn off a stove, sheepish about it at first on account of what they had said, and she turned none of them away and took no pay she could get out of taking. And the settlement's mind about Naomi Croft began to turn the slow way a mind turns, while before the night it turned all at once. There was one evening near the end of July that Amos carried with him a long time after. A gob of hot grease caught fire in the skillet at supper, flared up yellow near to the low ceiling, and the children froze, and Amos himself came half out of his chair, and Naomi did not so much as raise her voice. She clapped the iron lid down over the skillet in one motion and slid the whole of it off the heat, and had it smothered dead before Amos was fully on his feet, and she stood there a second with her hand flat on the cold lid and her face gone somewhere far off, and then she came back into herself and said, "Supper's fine, sit down." He noticed after that she never sat with her back to the stove. She always took the chair that faced it, and he understood why now, and never asked her trade. If you're still with us on this porch, do this story a kindness. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell. These quiet stories don't get told if you don't share them. Tag someone who loves a true frontier story in the comments, and let them know we're telling these the way they deserve to be told. August came in hot and dry that summer of 1884, the way it does in the high country, the creeks dropping and the grass going gold at the tips, and the afternoons stacking up thunderheads over the peaks that stood black and swollen and gave no rain, only wind and dry lightning that walked the ridge lines and set the hair up on a man's arms. Amos watched the sky the way every man watched it that time of year. He watched the old spruce snag that stood too close to the northeast corner of the barn, a dead tree gray as bone that he had been meaning for 2 summers to drop and never had, and he told himself he would get to it before the storms turned mean, and he did not. The hay was in the loft, all of it, the best cutting he had taken off that park in 3 years, packed tight and dry. The team of bays stood in their stalls, and the saddle mare in hers, and the milk cow in her stanchion, and in the far corner the old bitch dog had whelped a litter of 6 pups in the middle of the month, and Toby had gone clean out of his head over those pups. He named all 6 and could not be kept from them. And more than once Naomi had fetched him back from the barn at dusk and told him gentle but firm that the barn at night was no place for a small boy. He had promised and promised the way 5-year-olds promise, meaning it entirely and forgetting it entirely, both at once. The storm came at the tail of a still hot day, near midnight, and it came with almost no rain in it. Amos woke to the wind first, banging the shutter, and lay listening to the thunder come up the valley in long rolls he could feel through the floorboards, and he was thinking he ought to go down and settle the stock when the lightning hit the snag. It came down with a sound like the sky being split open with an axe, one enormous crack right on top of them with no count at all between the flash and the blow, and the whole cabin lit blue-white through every chink in the logs, and Amos was on his feet and down the ladder before the dark rushed back. He did not have to be told what it had struck. Through the window, the northeast corner of the barn already stood crowned in fire. The old dead snag split down its length and burning like a great torch and leaning its flames into the shake roof, and the roof taking it dry, as it was in about the time it takes to say so. Behind him, In the children's room, Ruth's voice went high and thin. "Toby's not here. Pa Toby's gone. His bed's empty." And the bottom fell out of the night. Amos did not remember getting the door open. He was across the yard in his nightshirt and bare feet with the heat coming at him in a wall, shouting the boy's name into the roar. And when he hauled the barn door back, it let out a gout of smoke that dropped him to his knees coughing. Inside, the horses were screaming. That sound a horse makes that a man never forgets, and the whole east end was fire climbing the wall and running the loft floor overhead where the hay had caught. And somewhere down in the smoke a small voice was crying. And Amos went in low with his arm across his face and could not find the boy and could barely find the floor under his own hands. Something came down behind him, a burning length of the loft rail, and caught him across the shoulder and back, and the pain of it drove him flat. And for a moment Amos Rourke lay on the floor of his own burning barn with the smoke pressing him down and thought, with a strange far-off clearness, that he was not going to get up out of it. He never heard her come. Afterward, he would try to work out how she had been so quick, and the only answer that ever fit was that she had not been asleep, that a woman who keeps a bucket by the door and a lantern where she can reach it is a woman who has been half awake for a fire every night for 4 years and does not have to climb up out of anywhere to meet one. What he knew was that a hand took his collar and hauled hard and dragged him back across the floor and out through the door into the air, and he came up gasping on the grass, and it was Naomi kneeling over him, and she had come out of the smoke with no panic in her at all. She had a wet blanket around her shoulders, soaked at the trough, and her wet apron in her fist, and her hair was down, and there was soot across her face, and her eyes were the calmest thing in all that fire. "Where does he go?" she said, close to his ear, not shouting though the roar was terrible. "The pups. Where are the pups?" "East corner." Amos got out. "Far corner. The whelping box." And she was gone. She went back in. That was the thing Amos could never after hold in his mind without his chest drawing tight. That she went back into the fire that had taken everything she had in the world once already. That of all the souls on that mountain, the one with the most reason to stand frozen in the yard and let it burn was the one who pulled the wet blanket up over her head and went in through that door a second time. Ruth had come running with the second bucket, and Naomi had turned her around at the threshold with one hard word. "The Rose girl. Run. Take the lantern. Go." And Ruth had gone flying off down the wagon road into the dark with the lantern swinging wild. Inside, Naomi went along the wall where the smoke ran thinnest, low, one hand out, calling the boy's name in a voice pitched to carry up under the roar, and in the far corner she found him. Toby, wedged into the gap behind the whelping box with the old dog and her 6 pups, his eyes streaming and his voice gone down to nothing, his arms full of squirming pups he would not let go of. She had not stopped to soothe him. She stripped the wet blanket off her own shoulders and threw it over the boy and the whole squirming mess of dog and pups both, and gathered the bundle of it up against her chest, and carried them out through the smoke and set them down in the grass a good way from the barn. Toby was alive, coughing and wailing and alive, with all 6 pups and the old dog, and Naomi's arms were scorched red from wrist to elbow where the blanket had not covered them, and she did not appear to feel it. The horses were still screaming. A gentler soul, or one with less iron burned into it, might have counted the boys saved and let the stock go, for the barn was a lost thing now, the whole roof a single sheet of fire and the loft beginning to fall in gouts of burning hay. Naomi did not. She soaked her apron again at the trough and went back a third time to the west end where the stalls were, and the fire had not yet fully reached, and she got the stall doors open one by one. The terrified horses would not go. They only wheeled and screamed and pressed to the back walls the way a horse will run right back into a burning building sooner than face the fire standing in the door. So she did the thing a person only knows to do who has thought a long time about fire in the dark. She tied her wet apron across the eyes of the first bay so it could not see the flames, and got a hand in its halter and put her mouth close to its ear and let it out blind and shaking straight through the door. Then she went back for the second and blindfolded it with a feed sack off the wall, and then the mare, and then the cow, and she brought every animal in that barn out alive into the yard. And the last of them cleared the door not 30 seconds before the whole loft came down in a roar and a fountain of sparks that lit the park orange and threw her long shadow out across the grass. Then, And only then, with the barn a bonfire behind her, and the stock milling and blowing in the yard and the boy safe in the grass, did she turn to Amos, who had gotten himself up onto one elbow and was watching her with an expression he could not have put a name to. She came and knelt beside him and put her hands on him. And here was the last thing, the thing that finished him. She was not gentle with her own hurt, but she was gentle with his. She worked his scorched nightshirt away from the burn across his shoulder and back and looked at it in the firelight with the flat, considering eye of somebody who had looked at 100 such burns. And she said, "This is bad, but it is not the worst I have seen, and you will keep the arm. So hear me and be still." She sent Ruth, who had come pelting back up the road with Cret and Delphia row close behind her, for the good grease and the clean linen and the whole crock of honey out of the cellar. And she packed the burn and bound it with a calm that steadied every soul in that yard, working by the light of the same fire that had made her a widow twice over. And she did not weep. And now, at last, Amos understood the not weeping for what it was, feeling hammered flat and made over into use, so that on the worst night of his life, the steadiest pair of hands on the whole mountain belonged to the woman they had all agreed to call cold. Delphia Rose stood at the edge of the firelight with her hand pressed over her mouth and watched Naomi Croft dress a burned man's back with the sureness of a battlefield surgeon, the boy she had carried out clinging to her skirt. Delphia, who had refused this woman her hand on the church step 3 weeks before, began to cry, which Naomi did not, and came forward and knelt down in the grass and said, "Tell me what to do. Tell me, and I'll do it." And Naomi told her, and the two of them worked over Amos together while Cret got the stock into the corral, and the fire ate the last of the barn down to a bed of coals. And the first fat drops of rain, come far too late to matter now, began at last to fall out of the black sky. Dawn came gray and wet over a black square of ruin where the barn had stood, the coals steaming in the drizzle, and it came over a cabin full of the living. Amos lay on his front on the bed with his back packed and bound, hurting worse than he had ever hurt in his life, but healing, alive, the arm his. Toby slept the ragged sleep of a child who has cried himself dry, with 2 of the pups tucked in against him, because no power on that mountain could have parted them. Ruth had finally come apart somewhere near first light, the way the brave ones do once the danger is behind them, sobbing into Naomi's shoulder in the corner by the stove, and Naomi had held her through it with her scorched arms and hummed the tune with no words until the girl slept. Now Naomi sat at the table in the wet gray light with her burned forearms freshly greased and wrapped in her own linen, drinking the coffee Delphia had made, and Delphia sat across from her, and the 2 women did not say a great deal, but much had changed in the space between them that needed no saying. Word of a thing like that does not stay up a mountain. Cret rowed down to the gap that same morning for more linen, and the story went out with him. And by afternoon it had gone all through the settlement. The fire on the Rourke place, and the twice-widowed woman who had gone into it 3 separate times, for a boy that was not hers and a man she was not even married to yet, and had brought them all out alive, and then dressed his burns without a tremor in her hands. Hollis Pruitt heard it at the very store counter where he had first laid his tongue to her name, and Elias Booth, who was behind that counter, made a point of telling it slow and full while Pruitt stood there with his hat in his hands. When Booth reached the end of it, he looked at Pruitt over the tops of his spectacles and said, "Cold as a creek in March. I believe you told Rourke. Twice widowed and never a tear. You want to ride up there and say to her arms, all burned to the elbow to save that man's team? Why, you're welcome to try." Pruitt did not say much. He loaded his wagon quiet. And when he came up the mountain 3 days later with the Rourke supplies, he came with an extra sack of flour and a bolt of good linen he would not take pay for. And he stood in the yard and looked at his own boots and said to Amos, "I said a thing about her down at the store before. I want it known I was wrong in it. And I've said as much to any man that'll hold still to hear it." And Naomi, who was in the doorway and heard the whole of it, came out and looked at his right hand, which he had burned himself 2 days back helping pull a stove out of a chimney, fire down in the gap, an ugly weeping burn across the palm he had been letting go untended out of pure stubbornness. She said, "Sit down on the step, Mr. Pruitt, and let me see that hand before it turns bad on you." And she dressed the burn of the man who had called her cold, with the same care she gave everyone who came, and Pruitt sat there on the step of the house he had gossiped about and could not lift his eyes to anybody. And when it was bound, he said thank you very low and went on down the mountain a quieter man than he had come up it. They raised a new barn in September, the whole settlement of it, the way that country did when a thing plainly needed doing. Cret Rowe organized the timber, and Elias Booth closed the store for 2 days and came up with his sons-in-law. And men Amos hardly knew came up the switchbacks with their tools, because the story had gone round and a man wanted to be able to say he had swung a hammer on the Rourke barn. The women came too, Delphia Rowe at the head of them now, no longer the judge of who was decent, but something warmer she had gone and learned to be, and they cooked for the whole crowd out of the Rourke kitchen with Naomi in the middle of it. And there was not a woman there who did not go out of her way to put a hand on Naomi's arm and call her by her name, the same name they had whispered over a month before. Toby ran underfoot with his pups. Ruth carried water to the men and told anyone who would listen, with the fierce ownership of a girl who has decided a thing and dares the world to argue it, that it was her Naomi who had gone into the fire. Sometime that first afternoon, Elias Booth drew Amos and Naomi aside and put a letter into Naomi's hands. Come up with Pruitt from the Gap, the direction on it written in a firm, careful hand. It was from the head nurse at the Leavenworth Fever Hospital, an older woman Naomi had worked under, who had heard the news the long way news travels, and had written to say what Naomi had meant in that place, and to send her blessing on the marriage and on the children, and to tell her, in a line Naomi read twice and then folded away against her chest, that a burned thing, given time and a little grace, will heal. By the end of the second day, the frame stood up clean and square against the peaks, the sweet smell of new-cut spruce lying over everything, and the men knocked off to eat, and Amos, who could stand now though he could not yet lift, stood at the edge of it with Naomi beside him and watched his neighbors climb down off the rafters of the barn they had built him. He had not asked her yet. Through all of it, the fire and the healing and the raising, the arrangement had stayed unspoken, and he had come to hate that he had ever left it hanging like a thing that could be sent back down the road. And now with the new barn standing and the light going gold on the high peaks, he found he could not let the day close on it unsaid. Naomi, she turned. Her arms were still wrapped, healing the slow way burns heal, and there was flour on her hand from the cooking, and she looked at him and waited the way she waited, level and unafraid. I want to say it plain because I've been a coward about it. And you've been braver than any of us since the day you got down off that wagon. He had to stop and get it under him. I told you when you came that we'd see how it suited. Both of us. I said it like a door I could shut. And I'm ashamed of it now, because you walked into my fire for my children when you had more reason than any living soul to stand in that yard and let the whole of it burn. There's no seeing how it suits. It suits. It has suited me since the night you sat on that bed and hummed to my girl and never once let go. I'm asking you to marry me, Naomi, to be my wife and their mother, if you'll have a burned old fool who took 3 weeks too long to see what was standing in his own kitchen. Naomi Croft was quiet a moment, and the settlement noise went on around them, and out in the yard Toby shrieked with laughter, and Ruth's voice rose telling him to mind the pups. When Naomi spoke, her voice was low and it did not shake, and her eyes, which the fire itself had never once wet, filled at last. I buried a husband and a baby in the Kansas ground, she said, and I told myself in the snow that night that I was done, that I would never again stand in a yard and watch a house I loved burn, because I could not live through that twice, and I knew it. And then I came up your mountain, and there were 2 children with chapped lips and no mother, and a man who left me a door to be sent home through, and I told myself not to love any of it, because loving it was how a person ended up standing in the snow. She stopped, and then the barn burned, and I found out I would walk into any fire on this earth for those 2 babies and for you, and that I had gone and loved the whole of it anyway, without ever once giving myself leave to, the way you come to love a thing when it has turned in a home while you weren't looking. She wiped her eyes with the back of one bandaged wrist, unhurried. Yes, Amos Rourke, I'll stay. I'll have you. Burns and cowardice and the whole of it. And that was all she said, but it was enough. And it was more of her own heart than she had handed to anyone in 4 years. And Amos understood exactly what the words had cost her, and exactly what they were worth. The circuit preacher married them in October, in the meeting house at the Gap, with the whole settlement crowded in, and Delphia Rourke crying in the second row, and Elias Booth standing up as a witness in his good coat. Naomi wore a dress of dark blue wool the women had helped her make, and on her right hand she still wore Daniel's plain band, and on her left Amos set a new one, and she did not take the old one off, and he did not ask her to, because he understood by then that there was room in Naomi Croft for the dead and the living both, and that the keeping of Daniel's band was part of the very way she was able to love it all. Ruth stood up beside her, holding a fistful of the last purple asters from the High Park, and when the preacher pronounced them, and Amos bent to kiss his wife, it was Toby, 5 years old and without a scrap of shame in him, who piped up loud enough for the whole meeting house to hear, "Is she our ma now?" And the whole room laughed and wept in the same breath. Naomi crouched right down in her wedding dress and gathered the boy in and said, "I am, if you'll have me." And Toby said, "I already got you," with the flat certainty of the very young, and that was the truest thing said in that church all day. They went up the mountain in the wagon as the light died. The 4 of them, the new barn standing dark and square against the last of the sky, and the cabin windows glowing ahead where Delphia had gone up before them to lay his supper and light the lamps. Amos drove one-handed, his back still stiff under his coat, and Naomi sat beside him with Toby asleep across both their laps, and Ruth leaned in her other side, and nobody said much because there was not much left that wanted saying. When they came up onto the bench, and the whole High Park lay below them silver in the dusk, the same view that had caught her breath the first day she came up, Naomi looked out over it a long moment at the new barn and the lamplit cabin and the peaks going dark above, and Amos felt her go still the way she did, gathering something up. Only this time he knew it for what it was, and it was not fear. That night, after the children were down and the supper cleared, Naomi set the bread to rise for the morning, covering the bowl with a cloth and standing it near the stove where the warmth was, and she banked the fire the careful way she always banked it, and she filled the bucket at the door, because some habits are bought too dear to ever set down, and there is no shame in a woman keeping the water where she can find it. Then she took down the Bible from the shelf, the one that fell open of itself to the book of Ruth, because she had read it so many times over, the account of the widow who followed love into a strange country and was not turned away at the border of it, but was gathered in and given a home and a name and a place of the harvest. She read a little by the lamp with Amos beside her, his hand laid over hers on the table, both their rings catching the light. The lamp burned steady in the window of a house that held, this one night, every soul in it alive. Out past the glass, the new barn stood in the dark with the horses she had saved breathing easy in their stalls, and the pups asleep in the fresh straw, and above all of it the cold, clean stars came out over the mountain one at a time. And Naomi Croft, who had come up that road, a stranger the whole country swore was hardened and bitter and cold, sat there in the lamplight in her own home with her own family gathered around her, seen at last for exactly what she was and had been all along, and let herself, in the warm and the quiet and the safe of it, finally be home. Thank you for staying until the last word. If this story moved you, the next one is already up on your screen, so go get a watch. And if you haven't yet, subscribe and join the porch. We're telling stories about women who carried more than the world ever knew. See you in the next one.